Hello. I'd like to discuss something today along the lines I'm going to call, is the so-called narcissist who feels so deserving actually correct? What do they deserve that they aren't getting, in other words? And then this cycle of feeling deserving being perpetuated. There are some things I think to look at here. For instance, why wouldn't someone feel deserving when they didn't get what some other people got in life? You could say that they were born with the short end of the stick. They missed out on something. And while some people have said of the so-called narcissistic personality disorder that you really can't understand how such people became as they are, I think some others would say it's rather a no-brainer, in that what they missed out on as the so-called narcissist now is love. They missed out more technically from perhaps being given a lot of empathy and on a consistent basis as young children, and basically a good stable upbringing too. And third, I would say by parents, as opposed to some other sources of upbringing, or let's say a grandparent would be an acceptable substitute too, if not sometimes even better than a stressed out parent. But at any rate, if one didn't receive this sense of stability and empathy too, but instead received emotional neglect or being put down on occasion, or shamed, or even hit, well, I suppose then this person would feel very unstable as a child, very insecure, and as a result, as an adult, this might turn into what we would call narcissism. I would hesitate, though, to use this term at all, narcissism. I don't like the term at all. It's very stigmatizing in my mind. And secondly, as a dear friend of mine in her 80s now once told me, she believes everybody has some degree of narcissism in them. And what I mean by narcissism, my own interpretation, is the desire to be number one, at least in one's own little sphere of who one runs across day by day. Call it your pond, so to speak. And then to put others down, too, in some manner, often maybe unconsciously and with body language, intonation of your voice included, so that this conveys a sense of power. And I know Dr. Romani, who is an expert and has much material on YouTube about narcissism. She says that the basic element of narcissism is to secure power. And in my mind, it would be power against going through again what one did early in life, let alone whatever might come up, but especially a repeat of something from the past. Now, I think I first got my first clue and understanding of some of this material by having looked at a book by Judith Vorst, Voirst. This was perhaps written 30 years ago, and the name of the book was Necessary Losses. And that title alone doesn't say so much, but she talked of the importance of maybe stability, bonding in childhood, attachment issues, and how if this is missing, that the child will feel insecure, I suppose. So then I think then this is the crux of where this so-called narcissistic element in some people comes to the fore. And when I mean that we could call anyone narcissistic, I mean that they have this trait to the extreme and not just an average or low-level amount. Because again, I would say, and some others do too, that we all have an element of wanting to feel powerful, or powerful enough to combat some things we consider a threat. And what better way to feel powerful than to feel number one, if necessary. So we hear the phrase so often that so-and-so feels so deserving, and they would probably apply this to this term narcissist. But then, why would anyone feel so deserving and this be a perpetual state of mind? In my mind, it would be for two reasons, or three perhaps. First, that there tends to be very little sympathy, I believe, accorded to the so-called narcissist in the first place. Consider, for instance, if someone has been sexually or physically abused or suffered abuse concerning neglect, well, I think a lot of people might want to climb on board the bandwagon and say that they deserve a lot of compassion and respect for the situation they went through, and that perhaps social services might come in and perform some kind of rescue act, although perhaps it's not always to their benefit. But at any rate, the public would rally to their cause, especially if it were documentable. But what about abuse that is not visible or even provable? Say, there's no sexual abuse or physical abuse and no signs of malnutrition, just emotional marks of low self-esteem and other elements comprising narcissism. Well, then I suppose the narcissist, so to speak, is not going to find themselves getting much sympathy in comparison. So surely then, as long as a person who suffers from narcissistic elements in their persona never gets much sympathy at all, but instead just the opposite, castigation, shame, kind of like a whipping boy, if you will, even scapegoating, then of course I think such a person would say they feel deserving and that this be perpetuated in their lives because they never yet have probably gotten any sympathy at all. And I mean too, even from most therapists and even practitioners who specialize in narcissism and narcissistic abuse. I'm not going to mention any names at this point, but some narcissistic experts who are therapists at the PhD level even, I've observed have a certain amount of contempt for narcissists. And also say they're very unsuccessful in treating these people and would rather just treat the people who have suffered abuse from a narcissist. And they tend to say narcissists are untreatable too in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as used by psychologists and psychiatrists in the United States in particular. But my own take on this is that the so-called narcissist isn't necessarily untreatable at all. It's much more a matter of the people they see for treatment not being able to handle, you might say, a certain amount of insults to their self-esteem. That the practitioners offering treatment to narcissists have a somewhat vulnerable sense of self or self-esteem themselves, and when their esteem is attacked by a narcissist wanting to put others down, including the therapist, there's probably what amounts to in psychiatric or psychoanalytic fare as a countertransference, and in other words a reaction in kind of disgust and contempt, a pushing away of such a patient, because of the injury to self-esteem given to the therapist. It's too uncomfortable, in fact, then, to treat a narcissist, most would say, honestly speaking, and they want that person out of the office as soon as possible, and what better way than to declare them untreatable, and the whole symptomology, the whole scenario as untreatable, and usher them out the door and wish them good luck, and perhaps urge medical treatment with medications of some sort. In other words, the upshot I'm saying is that I believe the narcissist, so to speak, is not untreatable at all. It's just that the therapy situation requires to be effective that the therapist have almost a bulletproof self-esteem, or no need for self-esteem at all. Perhaps almost a Enlightened Buddhist type of person who can take anything dished out at them. Short of that, I think they're going to have their own self-esteem wounded and want to retaliate against anyone putting them down in a therapy situation, especially by a, quote, narcissist who specializes in this for feeling a sense of safety. So this is the first point I would make, that a narcissist, so to speak, would, of course, feel deserving perpetually if they never get sympathy, and nobody seems to understand where their situation came from in the first place. Call it etiological understanding. So not only do they not get sympathy, they get castigation, shame, contempt, disgust feelings, and a general resentment by most therapists, I believe, that such people showed up on their doorstep to begin with. Second of all, and I think so true of so many abuse victims, it doesn't help one bit to be told there's a significant genetic component, and thus opening the door to saying that the situation is rather untreatable. And then how convenient to say this if the patient just happens to get under the skin of the therapist to begin with. So this doesn't help one bit either then, I think, for any abuse victim, including a narcissist, to be told that it's rather untreatable simply by way of genetics having a component part. When in fact, in my opinion, the genetic component to most all suffering is probably 5% at best, unless we're talking inheriting certain characteristics like your gender or your body type, and how that contributes to high levels of anxiety, say, due to vulnerability to physical force and intimidation in general. And so, why wouldn't the, quote, narcissist feel hopeless, in fact? Right from the get-go, they may have read up some material already about their situation before seeking any therapy, if they do, and see that it's said that most practitioners see it as untreatable. And then there being the claim of a genetic component, say, and why wouldn't such people feel hopeless then? And often not even seek help. It not helping, once again, that society tends to take certain people and turn them into scapegoats. And I think when emotional suffering and reactions to it are concerned, the so-called narcissistic approach is one facet that does tend to get scapegoated. Finally, and I see this as commonplace amongst all abuse victims, so often today, many people will say, even on YouTube channels, that such persons are simply playing the victim card and need to move on. But that's easier said than done if there's no way of moving on. Isn't that the whole crux? How does one move on from trauma if one either is not an Einstein with genius-level intellect and plenty of time on one's hands for, say, 20 years to work through the issues oneself, perhaps even reinventing the wheel as to understanding the whole situation about narcissism in the first place. And barring that, barring a person being Einstein and using it to their advantage, well then what are their other options? In fact, most people cannot even afford or even find depth therapy today, psychoanalysis to begin with. And if they could find it and afford it and stick with it, with a kind practitioner who has almost a bulletproof sense of self-esteem, well then the next question is, if I didn't say so already, who can afford it and find it? Is it available, this kind of treatment? Maybe the practitioner type I'm talking about who would be effective not only doesn't grow on trees, but is very, very rare. And so surely then there's a sense of hopelessness concerning this kind of victimization. And how can anyone then justifiably say these people are hanging on to their victim status if there's no way of moving beyond it because there is no treatment modality available to move on? Of course such people would say they're the victim permanently. It's just like losing your legs in a war, say, and never being able to grow them back because there's no one yet available who can make this happen, by snapping a finger especially. So in a sense, a person who's lost their legs has lost them forever usually, and in that sense they are a victim. Albeit there may be some other ways to compensate in life, like with a wheelchair. So for the person who lost their legs, they may no longer be justified in calling themselves a victim if they can get a wheelchair, say. But where is the wheelchair equivalent for the narcissist who can't get excellent psychiatric treatment or therapy treatment? I defy anyone to show me a wheelchair solution for a narcissist, including medications. For in fact, most psychologists and psychologists plainly state that medications are of little or no benefit to anyone with a, quote, personality disorder, and they consider narcissism to be a personality disorder. So I'm sure the narcissist and some other victims of trauma too are very, quote, sick and tired of being told they're holding on to their victim status if there's no way of moving beyond. They're not Einstein. They don't have a lot of time on hand in general. And third, there typically isn't the quality treatment available necessary. Maybe even the theory is not at a point where it needs to be yet in general. So I would say, to recap, that of course a narcissist would feel deserving and keep harping on this perhaps from time to time, or it manifesting in their attitude. For they are deserving in a sense, deserving of not having gotten what some people around them got, a certain amount of stability, love, empathy, but moreover, a sense of deserving quality treatment for this, or at least an acknowledgement that no treatment is available, and thus they deserve sympathy on this accord alone, that they have basically what some would say is often an untreatable disease, and there, by the way, really being no means of financial compensation from the government, say, on a disability rating scale for narcissism. At least in my books, I've never seen anybody get a disability rating for narcissism. For PTSD, say, yes, but not for narcissism, not for a lack of love. So, of course, once again, why not feel deserving if there's no way to move beyond, and there isn't even any disability system giving compensation, let alone not just $15,000 a year, but maybe $1 million a year or $5 million a year. And again, once again, there's no sympathy accorded the narcissist either, as there is for the sexually or physically or neglected child. And the salt is only rubbed in the wounds all the more, in that I believe the so-called narcissist probably has to forever endure to some degree a series of broken relationships, inability to form long-term relationships in general, ensuing severe loneliness, and many addiction issues, at least addictions of the sort to materialism, objects, status, things we don't necessarily call an addiction in the drug or alcohol sense. And there's generally being a sense of hopelessness in life. Now, once again, I would say I don't believe the situation is hopeless for any, quote, psychiatric situation, any medical, any emotional suffering in general, but this generally cannot be solved by oneself, I would say, and secondly, the help one secures or seeks out is critically important as to the quality. And by quality, I don't just mean intellectual capacity, but the level of both empathy in the client's help, and secondly, the capacity of the therapist, shall we say, to have almost a bulletproof sense of self-esteem that they can take anything the, quote, narcissist dishes out. I would say this probably also applies equally, by the way, to those with, quote, borderline personality disorder who seek out treatment too. The same effect applying that the average therapist isn't going to be able to emotionally handle the assault to their self-esteem from the borderline client, and thus often be deemed untreatable too. But my thinking is that were the suffering person with narcissism, say, to find that needle in the haystack, perhaps, who has high empathy and patience and bulletproof self-esteem, then I think they're going to really get somewhere. And the matter is then just of hanging in there, hoping to find, against considerable odds, that practitioner who can really help. This might not even be, by the way, a college-trained therapist, so to speak. It might be a life coach who's gone through this themselves and come out the other end considerably. Or it might be someone in the spiritual tradition, a Christian minister, or maybe a Buddhist helper. So I don't offer any quick solutions other than to never give up. And a phrase I love that I once ran across being, it ain't over till the fat lady sings, or it ain't over till it's over. And thus to never give up, because to give up would be, in this sense, to give up on finding that practitioner who might finally make a difference. Or if we're not even talking a practitioner or religious advisor, that one special friend that you may not have met yet, but may someday come across by, quote, accident, or some would say divine providence. Again, I have no quick solutions. Life can be very painful, I'm sure many know, but I would again urge that all of us hang in there if we have suffered much and it seems that there's no obvious solution or even hope. That again, maybe we can make our mantra phrase, it ain't over till it's over. Because you never know what might drop in your lap one day in terms of that special person who can make a big difference. I wish you well.